Crioso, and welcome back to the Welsh History Podcast, Freeform Edition, Episode 12. Today's episode is going to talk about the problem of having issues that will come up from time to time that will be controversial, how we deal with them, how I personally deal with different things, and why I do it the way I do. In part because of a question that came out through social media where someone made the comment that they felt I was going a little to one side of the political spectrum or the other. And I just wanted to address that right now, in part because I think it's a good subject to talk about. I think it's good to talk about sort of the conflicts that can come into Welsh history that people will disagree with. I mean, it's always going to be that way. There's always going to be perspectives that change. People have different reasons why they support different things. And because of that, we're always going to have kind of the conflicts that you'll see around these discussions. I guess the easiest way to compare it, if you want to understand it, is the perspective about St. Patrick's Day in Ireland versus the USA. Why do Irish people sometimes get offended with the way the US celebrates it? Why is it sometimes that in the US it seems to go much more overboard than, say, in even Ireland, which is supposedly the place where the whole St. Patrick argument came from? And why do Irish people feel the way they sometimes do? And I would say, let me clarify real quick. This is not every Irish person. It is not every American. Much like everything else we're going to discuss, not everybody feels the same way. So let's keep that in mind. But there are some people who feel like that America has kind of taken over the holiday, are kind of acting in a way that isn't traditionally what the Irish population does, that it seems to build a lot on stereotypes and a lack of sympathy or understanding. And are they right? Are they wrong? It's not for me to say. I myself don't have any Irish ancestry, so I don't really have a linkage to the issue. In fact, I long ago stopped wearing green on the 17th of March many years ago, and I haven't really felt the need. It's not my thing. I've only ever, I think, brought it up once because I happened to stream on it one time, and that was basically it. So for me, it's never been a big thing. In Canada, typically it's not a big thing. We don't really rush around and get all St. Patrick's Day up. There are people that do, to be fair, but typically we do have a lot of Irish people that live in Canada, but I would say it's a little different than the way it is in, say, Massachusetts or Chicago, where there are much larger pockets of Irish people that live there, and thus the reason why it became so popular. So the only equivalent I can really come up with in this whole discussion from a Welsh perspective is the treatment of the Wrexham football team, the purchase by Rob and Ryan, Ryan Reynolds and Rob McElhenney, in case you don't know, and how that's kind of affected a perspective amongst some people, and I wouldn't even say some Wrexham fans, because I would just say it's people who believe that this whole thing is kind of created a problem. And I think it's a problem that actually happens at the Premier level, that they're leveling at Wrexham, that I don't necessarily think is bad, or as the percentage is not high that agree with them. Let's put it that way. And we've discussed this whole idea of plastic fans before, so I don't want to go into it, but I just wanted to bring that up so you understand that your version of what is a controversy, or what is your version of a conflict or pushing an agenda, may be different from someone else's. So I just wanted to address that a little bit. Let's start out, I think, first by addressing a couple of early episodes that I had. And I remember before I recorded both of them, I knew that there was going to be some sense of controversy around it. What I didn't realize is that the controversy was going to be more on the one than the other. But I knew both would have controversy, but they're for different reasons. And so maybe that's why. One is the story of the Druids and the Celtic background of, or lack thereof, of Iron Age Britain. It's a debate that's gone on between historians and archaeologists and lay people, if you want to call them that, for years and years and years, because the perception of the British people that survived the invasion of the Anglo-Saxons and later Normans is that the survivors were Celtic of origin, and thus, Ireland, Britain were Celtic nations. Now, that, of course, as we pointed out throughout this podcast, and I hope it's been made clear, Celtic is a very strange word. It is a controversial word that's used because we don't even know if that's what these people have called themselves. Would they have called themselves? Is that culturally what they were? But there's enough evidence to display that there were some cultural synchronicities between the people in the central part of Austria and Switzerland who make up what we perceive as to be the original origins of the Celtic culture and the expanding cultural use from that point all the way to the steppes of East Asia and to the far west on the British Islands, and that it expanded in a cultural standpoint, maybe more so than on a political or even, for lack of a better word, DNA standpoint, and that most people that originated from there did not spread out and become an invasion force that then moved into Britain, France, and Spain, and all these other places where Celts were to be expected or found. The problem with this is, of course, all of our perspectives on this originate from the Romans, who aren't real fussed with describing people in specific, and they do a lot of generalizing. If a people sort of does the same thing as this person, they're all a bunch of barbarians. And if this person is like this, well, then they're German. If they're this and this, they're Gauls or Celts. And all of that is very generic and very one descriptor. So with that in mind, of course, when we get into debates about what is and isn't a Celtic person, I think it's you feel how you feel. If you want to be a Celtic person who lives in Wales or somewhere else and you perceive your ancestry as Celtic, I have no problem with that. I mean, I at times have used the same phrasing, and but at the same time, over the years, I've actually kind of removed that from my lexicon. I hardly ever use the word Celtic when I'm describing my ancestry, and I would never really ever say that. I always say Welsh. And I mean, if I really want to be distinctive, I can say Cymru and be just as accurate, or maybe more so, some would argue. And that's 50% of my ancestry, if we're honest, because the other 50% is largely English, because my mother's side is largely English. Haha. And so it's hard to sort of sit there and say, oh, yeah, that's obvious. And of course, then it becomes more of a political and national debate because early Welsh writers and historians and even archaeologists were trying to justify the Saxon invasion and why it would have. And to be fair, the English were doing this too. So this wasn't just a Celtic thing, if you want to use that phrase. And so when you look at older writers who are writing in their own perspective, who are very affected by Roman terminology and Roman ideals and concepts from back then, especially when you have someone who perceptionally is from that era and he's describing a Saxon invasion where Celtic peoples are driven to the borders. I mean, he doesn't call them Celtic, he calls them British because they're Roman British. And that kind of tilts everybody's point of view. And then you get the big English writer who comes up, and now we're talking Bede and Gildas, of course, and also writes similarly and basically cribs from what Gildas has written to create the myth of how the Saxons arrived. That becomes, for centuries, and one might even say millennia, the understanding of how this worked. And it's only after we start doing more scientific archaeology that people start to question, well, actually, maybe this has changed. So without running down this rabbit hole yet again, we have to understand that all of this is a case of perception and labeling. And it's difficult to put things in a box when you're talking history because things change so frequently. And the reality of it is largely what we could be seeing is, rather than a forced migration invasion scenario, we're having a mild migration, which then leads into a combination of cultures, which then creates all these various English cultures. But for some reason, the language that they choose is Old English over the Latinized version of Cymraeg or Brythonic. And this is what creates the English people. So, in other words, they could literally be just old Roman Britons who became a part of a cultural standpoint, much like the Celts, maybe little more than culturally Celtic, but largely genetically the same people that lived there 10,000 years before. All of that is debatable, and all of it is, for some people, a difficult controversy to discuss. And it's colored by inaccurate history, in very one-sided understandings of history, both sides, because, I mean, some archaeologists went whole hog into the, oh yeah, there was no wipeout, these people just changed culturally, when there's now enough genetic evidence to show, no, there were German people who moved from what we now call Germany into what we now call England, and they did merge into the society that was there for sure, but it doesn't mean they weren't there to take or conquer, much like the Normans. The Normans didn't come in and whole hog take over England without having a presence. They didn't come over and just culturally influence Old English. They conquered it, and they conquered it with a lot of people, but not as many as who lived here. What they did was they cut off the heads of the government and took over the head of the government, and in doing so, then spread all of the wealth to themselves, holding the wealth for themselves, and then isolating the pockets of and major populations of Old English Saxon peoples to the position of the lower class. And it isn't until many, many years later that that class of people merges back into the Proto-Norman English society and becomes what we see as modern-day England. Same sort of thing here. You're not going to see a situation where there's a massive German population and a depopulation of Romano-British in England. It's more some Romano-British English die for various reasons. Again, there's an episode on that if you really want to learn exactly what all happened. And these people then, over time, replaced the leadership, the heads of governments, and became the heads of governments, or in some cases, maybe out of allegiance or maybe out of a forced situation, merged into what we now consider the English heterarchy because of a number of different reasons. And there is some suggestion, and we don't know for sure, that Mercia seems to be more, I'm going to use the term Welsh. I know it's not accurate, but just to sort of make that equivalation, that it's more Welsh than it was Saxon, and that it's only the language that really changed, but the people really didn't. And again, we don't have a lot of evidence. It's mostly about name conventions. That's difficult to always say, but it does show that there's still linkages going back to the old language and the old naming conventions. But I would argue that if that's the case, why has nothing outside of that stuck around? And Mercia didn't seem to keep the naming conventions beyond that. They became very English after that, but that's neither here nor there. Either way, however, it is controversial to discuss, and I think it's wise to understand that. When we talk about King Arthur, of course, that was a whole nother level, and it still comes up occasionally on the YouTube where people will listen to the episode and start commenting. And I know right from the beginning of where they're commenting, where they're going, and I'm like, oh boy, here we go. And sometimes people are like, yeah, I know this makes sense. And then other times people are like, no. So-and-so said blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, I mean, go ahead and comment that if you believe that, that's fine. I don't. and that's okay. I believe what I believe, and it may be, let's be honest, as accurate as anybody else. The reality of it is whomever this King Arthur-like character may have been lived in a time when history wasn't really written in depth, and we don't have an understanding of whom or what that person may or may not have been. So, because I don't necessarily consider him a real person, or if he was nowhere near what he's now described or seen as, doesn't make him any less valid as a possibility than anything else. It just, the evidence is just so minimal. The real evidence, let me put it that way, not the post reality written stuff that you get from Geoffrey Monmouth or later French writers, especially, that create a whole host of issues because they're basically creating stuff out of full cloth. And, it'd be equivalent to taking Mark Twain's version of the story and saying, oh, yeah, that's the real King Arthur. That's not how it works. Or taking one of the various movies that are out there and saying, oh, yeah, that's the real King Arthur. They don't know any better than you do. Largely, their history is terrible. Their understanding of it is terrible. They don't even have accurate, I've seen King Arthur movies where they're wearing full plate armor, and we all know that just didn't happen back then. They have them mistimed, misappropriated in that time. Even when I've seen people try and justify it by saying, oh, he's a Roman legionnaire, blah, blah, blah. There's just no evidence of any of this, and we just don't know. So it's very controversial, and I get it. For some people, it's really controversial. For other people, they're like, it's a fun story, and that's all it is. But there are people that are quite convinced of things, and they are very much invested in that story being real. And some of them come from Wales. It's in the best interest of some groups that Arthur exists, and more importantly, that he's Welsh, because then you can use him as kind of a club in a way to say, or use it another way as a tourist occasion. And you can kind of do that. It's the same way why Edward the First did exactly the same thing. It's why Henry VIII and Henry VII tried to link themselves to Arthur. There's a reason for that, and it's because it is a compelling story. It is a compelling idea about a leader who has risen up to defend his people from great persecution and becomes a mythological legend who could at some point come back under the right circumstances to save his people. God knows he should have been there a long time ago if that was the case. Because, well, we're well past the point where that should have happened. But the legends are there, and they're great stories. That's why they keep making movies out of them instead of movies out of stuff that I think would actually be quite interesting to do. Anything like the battles between England and Wales in the 800s, 900s, 1000, 1100, 1200. We could literally have movies and TV shows on amazing topics, but we're lost in this whole mythology around Arthur to the point where that's all we talk about. And it's frustrating in a way because it's like, well, it's a great legend. I get it. The story is really cool because we've had hundreds of authors take a version of it and make a little bit more, tapestry, but it doesn't make it any more accurate or true. And yet we have lots of very interesting historical stuff that we could touch on without it necessarily being massively stuck in a historic, having some historian going, they used the wrong kind of cloth there. They should have used this and blah, blah, blah. They don't need to do that. You can pull stuff from Bede that's so nebulous as far as understanding what's going on, yet sounds amazing. Like Cadwallon to me is a story that should have been told long ago and never has been. And I think it's largely because people in Hollywood don't understand. And there isn't enough people to kind of point out to them that, by the way, there's these, really Game of Thronesy like stories out there that you could actually use if you went to the bother and investigated. But anyway, or Penda, or there's just so many. It doesn't always have to be about King Arthur and Alfred the Great and William the Conqueror, or Henry VIII. You could diversify occasionally. Never seen an Owen Glyndwr movie done of any major variety by Hollywood. Let's put it that way. So anyway, so I'm creating controversy, but yeah, it's one of those things where the controversies in history are built around certain things. Now, why am I talking about this and kind of touching on stuff that seriously isn't a big deal? I mean, there's nobody out there that's going to live and die on these particular discussions, I would hope. And I don't think that even the people that are really believers in what they're advocating for are going to get bent out of shape. Well, because we live in a political society and sometimes cultural opinions nowadays affect our viewpoints in the past. And I think there's a misunderstanding, and this is really what I wanted to clarify and go into in depth. So currently we're talking in the 1800s in the podcast. If you're listening to the podcast right now, you know what I'm talking about. It's industrialization. It is very much about the beginnings of British change on a fundamental level, from everything from education to the way we look at work to the way we view how work is done and by whom, and the respect that is shown to various classes of people, and how various classes of people are slowly in this time period starting to gain a voice in a way that they didn't have before, and how that reflects on our modern society. And this is the first time, really, and I mean this, where we can say, oh, I see a direct link from this to this. The Magna Carta is a great document. It accomplishes a lot of things, but it isn't massively, overwhelmingly, this is the lead to everything that came after. I mean, I know people make that link, but let's be honest, there's a lot of steps that have to come about to go from, hey, we're going to give the English lords more power to, oh, by the way, democracy. It just doesn't work like that. So I wanted to kind of clarify on this because I think there's a misunderstanding. I have an individual, like I said, who's commented to say that I'm getting very, and I hate this term, but woke effectively. And I want to clarify some things on that regard. Now, I don't really care what you think of my politics. I do try and keep it out of most of the discussions here, but I think it's worth talking about, education, why it's important, why there are labor unions, how did they start, what is their influence, how have they changed how we view society and how we view a lot of different things. Are they good? Are they bad? Do they have good points? Do they have bad points? Is there overreach? Is there, did they effectively do certain things? If we're going to talk about the representation of women in society and how that comes up, that's going to be covered. And you can't avoid this. If you want to talk about history, you need to talk about all that you can about Welsh history. And that's what I'm trying to do. This podcast is going to try very hard not to shy away from stuff that's uncomfortable and controversial. We're going to talk about Margaret Thatcher, guys. I mean, I hate to tell you that if you're a big Margaret Thatcher fan, you might not love every take about that. If you love Winston Churchill, I guarantee you're not going to like every viewpoint about Winston Churchill, because I guarantee you there are people that don't love Winston Churchill. If you like Plaid Cymru and Welsh independence, you may not like every take in this podcast about Welsh independence. That's okay. I think that's what I'm trying to say here. It's okay to not like a take and maybe comment and say, I don't like that because that's fine. And I want to make some things kind of clear so that as an outsider, which I am, because I didn't grow up in Britain, I wasn't born in Wales. I didn't, I've lived there. I know people there. I have friends there, but I also understand that I will never understand it the same way as someone who was born there, lived there, and will die there, because their perception of things is quite different than mine. And that's okay. It's like if you come to Canada as a foreign person and move here, you're not going to understand Canada the way I do, but that doesn't mean that your perception of it is wrong. It just means you perceive it differently. And that's okay. I think that's what I want to make clear, is that I may not be accurate or right on everything I'm talking about, but I'm trying to be. So it's not about creating a controversy or an opinion where I am forcing on you my agenda, if you want to call it that. I don't believe in doing those kind of things. I had a political science professor I respect a great deal who said that when you come into his class, he's not a conservative, he's not a liberal, he's not a socialist, he's not a communist, but he will represent all of those ideas so that you can understand their opinions. Does he believe their opinions? That's a whole nother conversation, and you can find out if you talk to him. But during the class, he's going to take that side, and you may not like it, and you may be uncomfortable with the discussion points, and you have to decide what you're happy about. And you had to sort of talk him out of it. You know, he represented Quebec nationalism in a way that I think a lot of Quebec nationalists would have agreed with back then. He presented the Tory side of things pretty clearly like a Tory would. He brought, using Canadian politics, because that's what the course was, he brought the Liberal and NDP viewpoints, which are socialist or center left in the case of the Liberals. And he did so in a way that he presented a viewpoint. Did you agree with it or not agree with it? That's kind of what I try and do here. It's not about me telling you what my personal viewpoint is on everything. I will, of course, and do at times, bring it up. Let's be clear. So if this makes you feel uncomfortable, what we've talked about right now, let me be clear. I will be doing at least one episode that'll talk about LGBT stuff and talking about how that affected Wales and what is going on in the community. And I may try and bring experts in to talk about it because my knowledge of it is so minimal. And if you feel uncomfortable with that, I can't really help you because that's Welsh history. If we're talking about Welsh fascism in the 1930s, I can't protect you from that. If we're talking about Welsh communists and their somewhat troublesome viewpoints and justifications for stuff that was going on, I can't protect you from that any more than I would from Winston Churchill's tendency to be a very, very mega colonialist. I can't and won't protect the audience from the reality. And I will, however, to clarify, do my best to make it as historical as possible and not rely on one opinion or another when we're talking about a controversial subject. We need more than just me, for sure, and we need more than just one opinion or one book that may be effectively just a book to slag a particular person. You know, I know there are a lot of negative writers on Winston Churchill. I know there's a lot of positive writers on Winston Churchill. You have to have both. You have to have both perspectives because if you don't, then you're just pushing a viewpoint. And at that point, I have a problem with it. So, no, I'm not trying to present an agenda. And if you're uncomfortable with what's going on in the 1800s, understand that come the 20th century, you may be even worse. And I get it. Maybe you wanted to stick in the medieval period. Maybe your interest is in that era of Welsh history, and I understand it. But if we're going to talk about Welsh history from, the Stone Age to the modern day, which is my whole idea from the beginning, is that I was going to talk to the end of the 20th century about Welsh history, we're getting to points which are going to be controversial. We're going to talk about the sons of Glyndŵr and some of the behaviors of what can be perceived as terrorism in the name of Welsh independence. We're going to talk about what happened in places and countries where Welsh people were involved that aren't great. And those stories will continue to come up. And I'm going to be honest with you, if that is making you not like the podcast, I cannot help that. And I won't help that. That's just the way it is. And I feel like these stories need to be told. I think we need to understand the good and the bad. We need to understand where we, and I include we, because as much as, and I want to be clear here, as much as I understand people getting annoyed with the Canadian talking about Welsh history, and there are people that do, don't get me wrong. I think we have to understand that we have a colorful past. I mean, my ancestry moved here in the 1930s, 1929, 1930. But on my English side, they moved here long ago, and accusations could be made about those kind of people. Do I know anything about it? No, not really. Do I know the details of the good and the bad of every ancestor I've had has ever done? No, obviously not. That doesn't mean, however, that I accept that everything that was good and bad that was done by my country, my government, without or with the consent of my ancestors has to do with me is a different argument, and that's something I can bring up and we can discuss if you want. And so I think that's something to understand. We're going to talk about environmentalism and the rise of it in Wales and why it still influences politics today. We're going to talk about subjects that people today don't always love talking about, have very strong opinions about. And I get that. That's okay. Like, I hope you have strong opinions about it. I mean, why are you listening to the podcast if you don't, other than, I guess, to become informed? And that's good too. Uh, and hey, let me cover one little piece of thing, and this is not a criticism, so take it in what it means. It's as a listener of history podcasts, I was very frustrated that there was no Welsh history podcast when I was listening in 2014, 2015 to British history podcast, which I still listen to today, and others that kind of brushed over some of the Welsh history. At the time, to be honest, I didn't realize that the reason why it was being brushed over was because Welsh history was so vague and so hard to find at this time period. But it still bothered me. And so when by this time period, we're talking like Dark Age, Middle Age, early Middle Ages, late classical, whatever you want to talk about. And so for me, that was kind of one of the reasons that sort of drove me to start the Welsh History podcast was this feeling that Welsh history isn't getting a fair shake and nobody else was doing it. So as someone who loves history, as someone who is a failed, you know, not failed as in I failed the class, but failed as in I never got where I wanted to go with it. I'm not a history professor the way I was planning growing into my 20s. That's something that I still wanted to do, which is the whole reason why I started this podcast. This podcast is a attempt to teach history in a way that people will enjoy. And I hope you're enjoying it because you're listening. And many of you comment that you enjoy it. So I appreciate that. During the pandemic, I had a lot of people reach out to me and say that they found the podcast because they had nothing better to do. And they just basically went and blew through all at that point, I think 120 episodes and loved it. And I'm glad you did. And if you still love it, great. And if you love it less, that's fine. Everybody has points in the story where they may zone out and not want to listen to that part, or maybe they just don't care beyond a certain point, and that's okay. But understand that because there was a vacuum is the reason why I got into this in the first place. It wasn't to make money. It wasn't to try and, how should I put this? Overrepresent from a Canadian perspective, Welsh history, being another one of these North Americans who think they're blah, blah, blah. It's like, no, that wasn't the reason. The reason is because I have loved Welsh history since I was a teenager. And of course, I want to be able to find it. And not finding it forced me to start something. And because of it, I'm learning anyway. Like, I've learned a ton in this time period. It's 9 years since I started this podcast, and I can guarantee you I've learned more than anybody else who listens to this podcast about Welsh history because I started from a very small puddle of Welsh history going into this and had to, learn so much because of it. And I appreciate it because some things that I never knew, or in some cases, people that I didn't realize were massively important figures in Welsh history, just because they did something that was important to the world, are still important figures in Welsh history. Like the pirates that influenced a lot of what we perceive as being piratey stuff come from their Welsh backgrounds. There's so much and so many rich historical things. I mean, if I look back at before I started the podcast, what were my interests? My interests were typically the Dark Age and early medieval era, the Owen Glyndwr or late independence eras, and kind of those stories. And they fascinated me. I read tons about them. Roman Britain, totally, totally, totally love. So I'm always into that. The latter stuff, I didn't really know. And post Owen Glyndwr, I was very vague on a lot of stuff. So as we've gone into history now, I've learned a metric ton. And I appreciate that. I think it helps me to better understand what's going on, what has driven some of the things I see today and when I lived there in Wales, and why the thought process is the way it is. Why are political parties the way they are? Why is, one group like this and another group like that? And what's making it? That's fascinating to me, but it might not be fascinating to you. You might want to know about, well, what's Wells's contribution to World War One? We're going to get there. Who are the figures that in World War One were the heroes, the villains, the people who made up the Welsh contribution to the fight, and how did the war affect back home? All of these things I think are important. We get into World War II, we start talking about the toll on the civilians from bombing, but we're also going to talk about the formation of the Liberal Party and how it is influenced by Welsh history, the formation of Plaid Cymru and the national movements that have been created and what they do and how they influence Welsh culture and history to this day. The arrival and building of things like S4C, the Welsh television network. All of these things, Welsh language television network to be specific, all of these things are very, very important to the history of Wales. And I think that, as I said, I'm learning about them effectively with you. And I would always say to someone, if you don't find what you're looking for here, it's always good to look it up yourself. Go research something. If you heard something, and you're like, wow, he really didn't cover much on that. Please go look it up yourself. And if there are better versions of this out there from a podcasting standpoint, from a video standpoint, I'm sure there are. I mean, I'm not going to lie. I watch a lot of stuff on YouTube about Welsh history still. There are Welsh history people who have started up since I did, who are doing a great job of representing Welsh history. And content will continue to expand. I expect to see more and more Welsh history podcasts growing out of various people's interests. And I hope we do see that, because it is great. We are going to talk about controversial things. It's unavoidable. The podcast will hit a section in this which may make you uncomfortable. You may not like the discussion that we have, or you may dig it. You may find it fascinating. And it may be a part of your political opinion, or it may be against your political opinion. And that's okay. I think it's good to challenge yourself on stuff. And let me be very, very clear. My political opinions, while I do try and keep them out, will always creep in. I mean, I can't promise you that there isn't going to be a bit of my politics coming into this, my opinions on history. I'm a big believer in the fact that Wales is underrepresented in society, and it's to the detriment of society that we don't know more about Welsh history, especially among people who don't live in Wales, which is kind of the reason why I started the podcast. The point of the podcast is because if you asked people maybe 5 years ago, do you know where Wales is? They'd be like, huh? And that is a detriment to Wales. And I hope, and I've hoped from the beginning, that I'm doing justice to trying to cover Wales in a way that people who are not ancestrally linked to Wales, are not, someone who grew up in Wales or lived here for a brief period of time, are going to get interested in it, are going to start to find out about it, are going to start to learn about it. And hopefully over time, they'll pick up that. And no, my being Canadian isn't the same. I get it. I'm going to keep plugging away because I believe in this project. I believe in the need to have Welsh history out there. And I'm so grateful to all of you who listen, view, or in any other way interact with this podcast, positively or negatively. And I say it all the time, so this is nothing new. Yet you've stuck with me. Typical YouTuber getting upset because he reads 2 negative comments instead of the 400 positive ones. But I want to address some of it because I think there is a valid argument. Should I be the one doing the Welsh History podcast based on the fact that I'm not from Wales? Well, I would counter that by saying my grandfather moved to Canada before my father was born. But other than that, it's pretty close to about as direct as you can get without being born there. I lived there for 4 years. I still love Wales. I still want to go back, regardless of whether it's for the podcast or something else. And I will always, always, always have love for the people that are there because they liked me too. And because I feel an affinity to the place. Will I always get comments about people that say, well, what's this outsider talking about our things for? Yeah, absolutely. Should I? Yeah, probably. And I will counter that by saying, hey, I'm trying to get more Welsh people on the podcast to talk about Welsh history. I really, really am. I haven't had a lot of success doing it. We are going to keep working on it. And I promise you, it will not always be my viewpoint. And I have always tried to get, when I'm doing Welsh history, I try and get Welsh historians, or at least Welsh adjacent historians who understand it better than I do, to talk about it. And I always try and mention the name of the historian that I'm pulling from because I think it's important to recognize that they're the ones who've done the work. I'm just the guy regurgitating what they've done. And we need to respect academics who have worked on this and what they've offered to us. So with all that said and done, and a long-winded, sort of self-absorption, I feel like I just wanted to clarify a couple of things and answer a question that came up on X, which and then another one that came up on YouTube, and both seem to be focused on my language, my accent, and I'm like, well, I can't do anything about that, My being Canadian is what it is, but and you would not want me sitting here pretending to have a Welsh accent. You would not want that. One, I can't do it very well. I've tried. Two, I will also argue that when I try and do it, it goes very Irish. I'm not going to lie because it's just where my brain goes, I think, vocally. And I say this as someone who's played D&D for years and used to have a character who was supposed to be Scottish but always sounds very Irish. And I have no desire to try and misinterpret or, misrepresent who I am to you. So that's the other reason. And again, let me be clear. There are other people like Welsh Viking on YouTube, or you can go watch any number of other YouTubers and presenters who have presented Welsh history. If you really want a Welsh perspective, there are people now that actually are out there. When I started, you know how many were out there? None. It was a vacuum. The only Welsh history podcast of any variety was out of the BBC, and it ended in 2012. That's why I started this thingy. All that said and done, thank you all so much for all the words you do say, kind or otherwise, about this podcast, about me, the people who have, for many, many years, donated to this podcast through Patreon. My patrons have helped me through trying to get books for this podcast for nearly a decade now, and I really, really have always appreciated that. It, at the end of the day, books are expensive, research is expensive, it's not free, and nor would I expect it to be. I want to help those, who do the real research to help fund their research. I also would like to thank all of you who listen or view because all of you are the reason why I continue to do this. If suddenly everybody stopped tomorrow and I had to maybe wrap up the podcast, the one thing I will say is I probably do continue to buy books, continue to research Welsh history stuff because I'm not done with it regardless. But I would, you know, I'd see where the, the wind is flowing. But you guys have been so supportive and so willing to put up with my foibles that I am just so grateful to all of you. And with all that soppiness and continued love, thank you so much for viewing or listening today, whichever way you consume this podcast. And if you have questions, comments, or concerns, you can always reach me at the Welsh History Podcast at gmail.com. And of course, you can reach me at my various social media accounts at Welsh History Pod, with the exception of Facebook, where it's facebook.com/Welsh History Podcast. Don't know why. I think when I set it up, I think it was one of the first things I set up, and that's the reason why I got that. Whereas Welsh History Pod came about because at the time, Twitter, you couldn't do it any longer than that. And thank you all once again. All are fantastic. And thank you very much for listening, no matter where you are listening. And with that in mind, thank you all once again. Talk to you next time. Take care. Bye-bye. Welsh History Podcast is a member of the Evergreen Podcast Network. To find more information on them, you can do so at evergreenpodcasts.com. Thanks for listening.